Welcome to our viewers on public television in America and around the globe. It was a day of staffing announcements at the White House for some pretty major roles. President Trump made it official that Heather Nauert was his pick for UN ambassador. The current State Department spokeswoman previously worked at Fox News and, if confirmed, will be replacing Nikki Haley in the post. At the same time, the president announced that William Barr is his nominee to become the next Attorney General, following the departure of Jeff Sessions. It's a position Mr. Barr knows very well, having served in the job under President George H.W. Bush. And if that wasn't enough, the shake-up news continues, with reports that Chief of Staff John Kelly could be leaving his job in a matter of days. For more on all of the shake-ups, I spoke a brief while ago with Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill. Let's start with the Attorney General, an appointment after many weeks of an acting Attorney General, Niall. Do you think that the Democrats are likely to support this?
I don't think so, partly because I don't think the Democrats are frankly likely to support anything very much President Trump does that has some relation to the Robert Mueller probe, which this obviously does. Now, William Barr, depends what lens you look at him through. By some measures, he has rather conservative opinions. By others, he is part of the establishment in this country and therefore not as radical a choice as President Trump might have made.
A choice that is being seen as somewhat radical is his pick to replace Nikki Haley at the UN. Heather Nauert, now she used to be a Fox News anchor. Many are saying she doesn't have enough international experience.
Yes, that is a legitimate criticism, but I think it points to the fact that President Trump has different motivations in nominating her for this role. He clearly is someone who prizes communications abilities. Heather Nauert is perceived to have performed very well in her State Department role as a spokeswoman. I think what we're seeing here, Rajini, is the prioritisation of the capacity to communicate the president's message rather than playing an integral part in formulating that message in the first place.
Now, there's also a lot of speculation whirling around here in Washington, D.C. that President Trump's Chief of Staff, John Kelly, could be out of a job very soon. What are you hearing about this, Niall?
I have spoken to several sources on this today. Some of them were expecting John Kelly to already have been fired. There's a holiday senior staff dinner at the White House this evening. That had been expected by some to be a farewell to John Kelly. Now, that exact deadline is in doubt, but almost everyone seems to expect John Kelly to be departing from his role in the coming days.
And who might replace him in that case?
The key favourite is Nick Ayers, an aide to Vice President Pence. Mr. Ayers is considered a more political figure, someone with better electoral antennae than John Kelly. But Nick Ayers also has his own rivals within the building. So, as always with the Trump administration, it's not settled until it's settled.
Well, now let's move on, as we often do, to the president's tweeting today. A tweet today which has caused a lot of ripples here in Washington. It says, Mike Pompeo's doing a great job. I'm very proud of him. His predecessor, Rex Tillerson, didn't have the mental capacity needed. He was dumb as a rock. I couldn't get rid of him fast enough. He was lazy as hell. Now it's a whole new ball game. Great spirit at state. Exclamation mark. I mean, he doesn't hold back in that tweet at all, does he, about his former Secretary of State?
He certainly doesn't. I don't know really where to begin even commenting on that. Obviously, it's not something that any recent president would have done. No recent president has spoken in those kind of terms about any key former aide, much less a former Secretary of State. It does come in the wake of Mr. Tillerson making some pretty harsh criticisms of President Trump. The president argues that he punches back. He doesn't just attack people out of nowhere. But clearly, once again, an extraordinarily vehement expression of opinion and expression of criticism.
Now, Stanage, as always, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Now, prosecutors in New York have said that President Trump's ex-lawyer Michael Cohen should serve a substantial jail term over campaign violence and tax evasion. Robert Mueller's investigation's been looking at possible ties between the Trump campaign in 2016 and Russia. Today, they released a court document of their own, not taking a position on how long Mr. Cohen's sentence should be, but saying that he's gone to significant lengths to help the investigation. Well, to go through all of this, I'm joined now by Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Centre. Elizabeth, thank you very much for helping us wade through these documents.
Quite a lot here.
Michael Cohen was Donald Trump's former Mr. Fix-It. He has now been talking to investigators. Do we know any more about how he's been helping them?
Oh boy, has he been talking to the special counsel and investigators. What we've gotten so far are two separate memos, one from the local federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, and one very fascinating memo from the special counsel's office from Bob Mueller's team. And there are a lot of details in here about exactly what Michael Cohen has been telling federal investigators about President Trump, about the investigation, and in fact, because he has provided such significant information and continues to provide such information, they recommend that while he get a substantial sentence, it not be as bad as it could be. And one thing that I think is very interesting that we see from these documents, the Mueller memo talks extensively about the Trump Tower in Moscow project and how Michael Cohen lied to Congress about that project. Specifically, Mueller says, to minimize links between the Moscow project and Individual One, which we know Individual One is President Trump, and talks about how he continued to work with the Russian government and the Trump company and Trump himself through the campaign, which they previously had said they had not, and even talks about providing information, it says relevant and useful information concerning Cohen's contacts with persons connected to the White House during the 2017-28 time period. So we're talking about the campaign as well as after Trump came into office.
How explosive could this be in the context of an investigation that is looking into whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government?
Well, you have in these documents specific instances of where Cohen, acting in coordination with the Trump campaign, spoke specifically to the Russian government. They even talked, and he spoke, it says he, in fact, conferred with Individual One about contacting the Russian government before reaching out to gauge Russia's interest in having a meeting with President Trump. So that is extraordinary. It shows that there are these links, these communications between the Trump campaign or its surrogates and the Russian government, and that at least here the president and likely his family, because it talks about other company members, knew about it. So that is really extraordinary. Not to get lost in all of this, in the other federal prosecutor memo, they talk about the illegal campaign contributions that Cohen made, which is the legal term for the payments that he made to try to get these women who apparently had affairs with Donald Trump to be silent,
including Stormy Daniels?
Stormy Daniels, exactly, and Karen McDougal to be silent leading up to the presidential election. And it says that Cohen himself has admitted that with respect to both the Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal payments, he acted in coordination with and at the direction of Individual One, Donald Trump.
Wow, some interesting revelations from both of those documents. Thanks for helping us through all of that, Elizabeth Wydra.
My pleasure.
Next, trade tensions with China added to the market's woes again today, with the Dow Jones Industrial losing another 560 points. It came as the chief financial officer of Chinese telecom giant Huawei appeared in a Canadian court facing fraud charges relating to allegedly breaking American sanctions on Iran. Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of Huawei's founder, was arrested in Canada on Saturday. Prosecutors at the bail hearing in Vancouver said she could spend over 30 years in prison if extradited to the United States and convicted. BBC's Dave Lee was there for us, and I spoke to him a short while ago. Dave, what did you hear today at court?
Well, the hearing today, which is still going on, was to decide whether Ms Meng should be granted bail while those extradition hearings get underway, and that, like I say, those discussions are still going on right now. If she is extradited, of course, she faces potentially big trouble in the US. US prosecutors believe they have evidence that Huawei was using a secret subsidiary called Skycom in order to trade with Iran in violation of those sanctions, and that in order to do that, they had to deceive financial institutions in terms of where their money was going and where the source of that money was. Politically, as you say, this is becoming quite an ordeal now between the US and China. Beijing have made it very clear they're pretty incensed about what's happened. They've called the arrest a breach of Ms. Meng's human rights. They've also said that they demand her immediate release. But as I say, today, stage one of what could be a very lengthy process.
And so we're hearing as well that the US is accusing Huawei of trying to obstruct this investigation, Dave. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, we know that Huawei has been under suspicion for some time about its links to the Chinese government. In particular, the company has been under threat by multiple investigations into whether they are using telecoms equipment to potentially surveil some of the markets that they operate in. And Huawei have been very resolute in trying to defend themselves against that. The company is saying about this particular case is that they're saying that they believe that it's motivated politically and is anti-competitive, i.e. Huawei is becoming such a big player on the global technology stage that this is an attempt to squash that before it starts to overtake the likes of Apple and others. And it's worth noting that Huawei became the second biggest maker of smartphones in the world earlier this year, so it's definitely growing its reputation. They're saying this is motivated because of that, but the US is saying it's a different issue. This is about fraud, not about the nature of the legitimate side of Huawei's business.
And just briefly, you touched on it earlier. How does this leave US-China relations, which are already tense?
Already tense. There were signs, wasn't there, that by having dinner between President Trump and President Xi of China that things may be improving. But as that dinner was happening, this arrest was taking place. So I think if this isn't resolved quickly and if Ms. Meng has to stay in jail here in Canada, I think the relationship is going to get even worse than it is right now.
Dave Lee in Vancouver, thanks very much. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news. The driver who ploughed into a crowd of counter-demonstrators at a white nationalist rally in Charlottesville last year has been found guilty of first-degree murder. A jury took less than a day in ruling against James Fields for his role in the death of 32-year-old Heather Heyer at the Unite the Right rally. He faces a maximum sentence of life in prison. 11 people have been killed in 2 attempted bank robberies in northeast Brazil. The robbers launched the assault on the banks at dawn, but opened fire when they were surprised by police. 6 robbers and 5 hostages, including a child, died in the shootout. In France, a massive security operation is underway in preparation for more anti-government protests this weekend. 90,000 police officers will be on duty, with armoured vehicles deployed in Paris. Fears of a repeat of last week's violence on the streets has led to some shops and major tourist attractions, including the Eiffel Tower, being closed. The BBC's Lucy Williamson sent us this report.
The Champs-Élysées is again preparing for battle, a consumer paradise twinkling behind bars. Some shops still have reminders of last week's violence scrawled on their walls.
It makes sense to close. We've lost a lot of money, me and my fellow shopkeepers. It's enough.
Almost 90,000 security forces are being deployed across the country, and tourist sites, including the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower, will close. The government has released a video on social media. Protesting is a right, it says, but attacking property or the state is not.
Une petite minorité qui compte aujourd'hui dans ses rangs.
The Gilets jaunes include pacifists with good intentions, but also people who have been radicalized, exploited by extremist groups, and who want to topple the Republic. Faced with systematic organized violence, our forces will respond with firmness.
Tonight, this city is bracing itself. The heart of France's economic and political life has become a target for those who feel they've lost touch with both. The threat tomorrow is from extremist groups and violent saboteurs, but the disillusion touches poorer working families across France. Jacqueline is part of a new splinter group called the Free Yellow Jackets, who met the Prime Minister tonight for talks.
If we don't structure ourselves, we will fail. It's urgent that we choose people to represent us, or else we will have done this for nothing. It won't work if there are 10,000 people shouting at the same time, just making a racket.
Students across France have joined their own demands to the Gilets jaunes campaign. The Interior Minister said they'd been infiltrated by radical groups. The reason, he said, these pupils were made to kneel outside their school by police. Last Saturday saw the worst violence here in decades. What began as a protest over fuel tax rises has broadened into a leaderless movement that includes violent and extremist groups. To some, this protest is a cry of anger. To others, the start of a new populist opposition. The government says it's a monster that's escaped its creator's control. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. Kevin Hart's out as the host of the Oscars. Tweets from his past have stirred new controversy. At least 20 women have died of cancer in Ireland after their smear test results were misread. Vicky Phelan's living with terminal cancer and she sued the Irish government for her misdiagnosis. Nuala McGovern went to meet her.
Until recently, Vicky was a normal mammy. Earlier this year, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer and told it was terminal. Vicky discovered that one of her smear tests from 2011 had been misread and she wasn't told about it.
If my smear in 2011 had been correctly read, I would have just had to have a hysterectomy back in 2011 and I would have had a 95% chance of being cured.
Cervical Check is the company that runs Ireland's smear tests. Vicky sued the American laboratory that Cervical Check used to perform the smear test and the Irish Health Service for withholding the information from her. Hundreds of women found out their tests had also been misread. 20 women have now died. They're being remembered here in Dublin. 221 women with cervical cancer should have received earlier treatment. The fallout was huge. 2 senior people within the Irish Health Service stepped down from their jobs, and a review highlighted huge failings in the screening programme run by Cervical Check.
The other big one that we've achieved is that the state have agreed to pay for the immunotherapy drug that I'm on, even though this drug is not even licensed for cervical cancer.
After a fight for the drug, Vicky's tumour has shrunk by 50%.
I don't know how many more days of this I have. Simple as that, you know. When you're given a terminal prognosis, you just have to enjoy every day.
Vicky has no idea how much time she has left, but she can be assured that her struggle with the Irish government has truly made a difference.
Well, Washington isn't the only place with a revolving door at the moment. The hunt's back on for an Oscars host after Kevin Hart stepped down due to criticism that tweets he posted years ago were homophobic. Hart said he didn't want to be a distraction on Oscars night and said he was sorry he had hurt people. Our entertainment correspondent Lizo Mazumba reports.
Hey, Kevin, looking down the line, right?
It was only a few days ago that the Academy announced that Kevin Hart, once an invited guest at the Oscars, was to be the next host of a show watched by millions. But that was before it emerged that the comedian turned actor had a decade earlier made homophobic comments in his stand-up show and on social media. His response didn't help. It actually made things worse.
My team calls me, "Oh my God, Kevin, the world is upset about tweets you did years ago. Oh my God." Guys, I'm almost 40 years old. If you don't believe that people change, grow, evolve as they get older, I don't know what to tell you.
Move on. The Academy asked him to apologise, but he refused.
I chose to pass. I passed on the apology. The reason why I passed is because I've addressed this several times. This is not the first time this has come up. I've addressed it. I've spoken on it. I've said where the rights and wrongs were. I've said who I am now versus who I was then. I've done it. I've done it.
Within hours, he'd changed his mind and stood down from hosting, finally apologising to the LGBTQ community. Over the last few years, Kevin Hart has been seen as one of entertainment's most exciting new talents, appearing on screen with some of Hollywood's biggest names in films like Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, as well as more serious-edged roles. His next film sees him caring for a quadriplegic millionaire played by Bryan Cranston, but many believe he should have handled this week's events far, far better.
Hell yeah!
My bad, man.
If he's going to be on that mainstream stage, he's got to adjust his act. He should have been faster to apologise. It was very mealy-mouthed. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sorry, oh, I'm better. The whole thing's a mess. There's no winners here.
And that includes the Oscars themselves. With the ceremony now fewer than 3 months away, they're now searching for a new host, someone they're sure won't end up being surrounded by controversy in the same way that Kevin Hart has. Lisa Mazimba, BBC News.
Now, it's meant to be a time of peace and goodwill to all, but it seems that stress could be taking the sparkle out of the holiday season. A new study of 2,000 Americans shows that nearly 9 out of 10 feel under pressure over this period. More than a third of those questions said working out whose family to spend the holidays with can spark friction. And when it comes to the delicate issue of gift buying, well, 31% of people said they argue about how much to spend. Then there's the all-important question of who takes charge in the kitchen. Nearly a quarter of people say they argue over who cooks the festive turkey. Well, I've been finding out how to beat the holiday blues with clinical psychologist Dr. Joshua Claypow. Dr. Claypow, thanks for joining us. This survey suggests that the majority of Americans get incredibly stressed at this time of year. What is it about the holidays that brings that on?
I'm laughing because the holidays are supposed to be the most joyous time of the year. And it is actually, as you said, one of the most stressful times of the year. Really, two things that drive the stress. One, change in routine. Holidays means we do things differently. We eat differently. We have different schedules. We travel. So our bodies and our minds are in different places and times. Second thing, which is a more psychological issue, is our expectations. We rarely have realistic expectations during the holidays. And when you put unrealistic expectations and lots of change, you get a lot of stress.
And some of those expectations can lead to lots of arguments. According to this survey, something like 7 arguments will happen at this time of year between couples. How do you mitigate some of that?
Believe it or not, really is having realistic expectations. And what I mean by that is most of us go into the holidays with the expectation this is going to be the best year ever. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great and perfect, and we're all going to get along. And I'm not trying to be a Grinch of any sort, but to be able to say to yourself, this is going to be good. We're going to have some good times. We're going to have some bad times. And if there is tension, that doesn't ruin the holiday. Because very often what leads to arguments is this first initial conflict that sends a signal that everything is ruined, and you can't go there. You have to allow yourself to have a little bit of tension and simply recover from it like you would any other time.
So first of all, just expect that we're going to have a little bit of a bad time, but to also avoid that, are there certain things we shouldn't be talking about with our families and friends when we get together at this time of year?
I think the most important thing to do is to remind yourself that we're here for a reason. It may be a religious reason, it may be a familial reason, but we're not here to take on our family and friends. And so politics, religion, work, economy, those kinds of things tend to breed conflict. I don't think you have to stay away from them, but you have to constantly remind yourself that this is probably not the time to take on a major issue, because most of the time we are with our friends and family for a short amount of time. It's time limited. So remind yourself, I'm here to be with my family, and then remind yourself, it's probably not worth it to take on an argument for a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days.
Dr. Claypow, you seem very chilled out, so perhaps your advice definitely needs to be heeded this holiday season. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Rule number 1 there is don't talk about politics over the festive period. That might be impossible with everything that's going on here in Washington, D.C. I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. You can find me on Twitter at BBC RajiniV. Thanks very much for watching us here at World News America.